overseeing the program for Indo-Chinese refugee settlements. He went from there to become president of the Inter-American Foundation, which supports grassroots development in Latin America, and then as president of the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, which is committed to improving conditions for poor people in U.S. cities and in developing countries. Then he went to CARE. So during his decade at CARE, Peter was credited with expanding the scope of the organization from simply providing immediate relief to focusing on the root causes of poverty. And under his guidance, CARE became a force in sustainable development and emergency aid and reaches tens of millions of people each year across the globe. Since 2007, Peter has been a senior research fellow at Harvard University's Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, where he's actively involved in international relief and development efforts. I should note that his daughter, Emily Bell, is an MPA class of 04 from the Wilson School, and she's here with us today, so welcome back, Emily. Please join me in welcoming Peter, who will speak on the role of global NGOs in world politics, the case of international relief and development NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel honored to be introduced by Dean Paxson. I think we're so lucky at the Woodrow Wilson School to have her as our dean and to have been able to find her right here at the school. I know that I speak for a lot of alumni, including recent alumni who have expressed tremendous enthusiasm for your appointment as dean. So it's great to be here and to have the chance to be introduced by you as dean. What I'd like to do in the time we have together this afternoon is first I'd like to talk about the talk that was advertised for this afternoon, but also then have an opportunity to open up this session for an exchange, not only questions and answers on the specific topic, but if there are other things on your mind with which you think I might be able to be helpful, don't hesitate to ask those questions as well, or to make comments as you see fit. I am going to talk about the role of global NGOs in world politics, and particularly the case of international and relief and development organizations. Most observers of world politics seem to agree the era of American hegemony has ended. The multipolar world that is taking shape will be more politically chaotic and difficult to order neatly. Non-governmental organizations are hardly the principal drivers of these changes. Over the past 2 decades, the structure, content, and processes of world politics and policy negotiations have been changing. The changes are due in part to the end of the Cold War, the decline of the U.S. as the world's superpower, the rise of the European Union and China as counterbalances, and the increasing influence of rapidly developing countries like India and Brazil. The changes in world politics are also due to the decline of nation states in the globalized world, advances in communication and information technology, the burgeoning of globally networked communities, and the activism of these communities to help shape issues on national and global political agenda. Within the changing global landscape, NGOs, and especially on issues related to human rights, the environment, and international relief and development, have become forces with which governments, international organizations, and even corporations must contend. And in these issue areas, the role of NGOs in world politics has become increasingly salient. From 1995 to 2005, as Dean Paxson said, I served as president and CEO of CARE USA, one of the largest development and relief NGOs. And currently, as part of my responsibilities at the Hauser Center, I chair something called the NGO Leaders Forum, which brings together the CEOs of 12 of the most significant US-based NGOs. Many of them, most of them in fact, are affiliates of larger global organizations. This NGO Leaders Forum, its purpose is basically to bring together the heads of these larger NGOs twice a year to explore issues that are or should be on their agenda, and to engage in candid, trust-building conversations that can be translated into greater cooperation and collaboration among them. While these NGOs take pride in their distinctive respective organizations, I'm struck by the common characteristics and shared directions that the organizations have taken. Besides CARE USA, the cluster includes such NGOs as World Vision, Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, International Rescue Committee, Oxfam, Habitat for Humanity, MSF, BROC, the Bangladeshi-based organization, and Mercy Corps. And briefly, what I'd like to do is to explore with you three questions. How have these organizations changed over the last 2 decades? What assets do they bring to their engagement in world politics? And what are some of the limitations on their influence? The first thing that strikes me is how the size and scope of these NGOs has changed. Today, the large ones are very large indeed. CARE USA, with a budget of nearly $700 million annually, has a staff of more than 10,000 and a presence in some 70 countries. World Vision is larger still, with a budget of more than $1 billion. This is just World Vision US. Collectively, the 12 organizations represented in the NGO Leaders Forum and their international affiliates have a combined annual budget exceeding the agencies of the United Nations engaged in international relief and development. It was not so long ago that most of the NGOs now in the forum, with the notable exception of Oxfam, regarded themselves as manifestly non-political. They were almost exclusively engaged in the relief of human suffering, in the amelioration of poverty through the direct delivery of services. Only Oxfam has long embraced a role in policy advocacy as well. Today, these NGOs still seek to avoid political partisanship, but all of them have come to acknowledge that they must be political in important ways. What changed? Most fundamentally, these NGOs now reject the idea that extreme poverty is an inevitable part of the human condition. Their leaders and staff believe that the knowledge, technology, and wealth already exists in the world today, that what is lacking is the political will to reduce and ultimately end extreme poverty. Most of these NGOs began by delivering humanitarian relief, and they are no longer satisfied to work solely on the symptoms of poverty. They want to attack proximate causes, such as literacy, disease, and malnutrition. They're also grappling with such underlying causes as discrimination, gender inequities, social exclusion, abuse of authority, and even violent conflict. Once proudly apolitical, the leaders of these NGOs now realize that promoting development and reducing poverty must be political in at least three different senses. First, NGOs must be aware of the distributive aspects of their work so that they do not unintentionally accentuate inequities and social divisions. They have become more conscious of the importance of who participates in decisions about the allocation of resources, who benefits, and what the mechanisms of accountability are. Second, NGOs increasingly understand that the reduction of poverty in terms of increases in empowerment. Economic growth is necessary, but not sufficient. The aim of these NGOs is to increase people's effective control over important decisions in their lives, in the lives of their families, and in the communities in which they work. And even, I might add, in the nations in which they work. Third, to sustain the changes they want to see in the world, and most importantly, the reduction of extreme poverty, US-based NGOs now seek to influence government policies, both in the developing countries where they work and in the United States. These NGOs are training citizens in poor communities to hold their governments accountable and building constituencies in the United States to demand effective policies to reduce global poverty. CARE employs experts in policy analysis and advocacy, not only in Washington, but also through its international confederation. CARE International has advocacy staff in locations like Brussels, Geneva, and at the UN in New York City. Volunteers in the CARE Action Network and send thousands of email messages and make many hundreds of phone calls and visits to members of Congress in Washington each year, and to members of the executive branch as well. Observers whose views of international humanitarian NGOs like CARE were formed a decade or two ago will find these organizations almost wholly transformed. They're not just handing out relief supplies or delivering services to desperate people. They are no longer charities in the traditional sense of the word. They have more of an edge and have become cause-related organizations. These NGOs are no longer merely so-called implementing organizations. Although they are operational, at least in some instances, they can negotiate the terms of their operations with governments that might at first seem unlikely to permit them to operate. For example, it is remarkable that CARE has been able to work in Afghanistan continuously since 1960, except for the period of the Soviet occupation. During the rule of the Taliban, CARE was able to engage in respectful negotiation with the authorities, laying down a set of principles under which we would function. One of the 10 principles, for example, was respect for internationally recognized human rights, even while being sensitive to the local culture. The Taliban did not permit employment of women, except in projects related to health. So all of our projects had the words, quote, and health, unquote, at the end of their title. The Taliban decreed that we would not permit that they would not permit the education of girls. but CARE worked with more than 250 community schools that enrolled girls. The Taliban knew it, but at meetings with Taliban officials, we would talk only about children and not about girls. When inspectors opened the school doors, they were not pleased, but said nothing, realizing that the schools were vigorously supported by the parents and elders in the community. Negotiations, tacit and explicit, of this sort do not always succeed. CARE, for example, responded to the famine in North Korea, as did some other US-based NGOs. But when the famine abated, we concluded when we were that we would have to leave North Korea. And why? Because we were unable to negotiate satisfactorily with the North Korean authorities to gain the kind of access we would need to make sure that under more normalized conditions, the people for whom the food that we were delivering was intended actually received it. In the midst of civil conflicts, CARE has come to play roles that go well beyond the traditional humanitarian assistance. In the late 1990s, after 20 years of responding to one recurrent humanitarian emergency after another in Sudan, we decided that CARE could not it would not be responsible on our part to retain our operations there in Sudan, with also actively working toward the achievement of a just resolution of the conflict within the country. And I'm speaking particularly of the conflict between the North and the South. After all, the long-running war was itself the underlying cause of the disastrous epidemics and famines that occurred in the country. In our initial meetings with senior officials of the Sudanese government and with leaders of the rebel movement as well, they pushed back hard, accusing us of politicizing our role in the country. And ultimately, however, they engaged with us, as did the diplomats mediating and supporting the peace process. And CARE, together with a coalition of like-minded NGOs that we helped to form, contributed information, ideas, and international advocacy for the peace process. Our distinctive contribution was in conveying the concerns and aspirations of poor communities in the North and the South, and in helping to create space for their voices to be heard by the political mediators. In El Salvador, Sierra Leone, and Nepal, among other countries where CARE worked on both sides of the lines of conflict, we similarly lent support to peace processes. Over the last 2 decades, the emphasis of NGOs like CARE has shifted from direct delivery of services to building the capacities of local organizations. Part of the shift has been in heightened attention to developing local management and leadership. Of the 10,000 CARE staff, all but a few hundred nationals of countries where all but a few hundred are nationals of countries where the CARE programs are located. One of the most important contributions of CARE is the training and development of these staff, so they rise into senior management positions, then often going on to positions in government or to start NGOs of their own. Some of the largest and longest established NGOs, including Oxfam and Save the Children in the UK, World Vision, and CARE in the US, Médecins Sans Frontières in France, have sought to globalize by forming broader international federations, initially establishing affiliates in other industrialized countries. And over the last decade, a growing number of these alliances have also invested in building affiliates in developing parts of the world. Virtually all of the globalizing NGOs, ranging up to nearly 100 national affiliates in the case of World Vision, have sought to expand the number of their private governmental donors and the number of their citizen constituents around the world, to draw on the special strengths of each of their affiliates, to establish shared missions, program principles, standards, and systems, and to build global networks for policy advocacy. Now, the biggest NGOs have gained, I think, a certain reputation for working separately and sometimes at cross purposes. But given the complexity of the task of reducing poverty, and given the recognition on the part of these organizations that the American public expects them to cooperate with one another, the larger NGOs have shown increasing willingness to collaborate, in fact, with one another, and indeed to collaborate as well with local NGOs and governments, and even with corporations, particularly over the last decade. They understand that the power of advocating in coalition, and have done so to push, for example, for the international treaty to ban landmines, to promote reconstruction in Afghanistan, to support then President Bush's initiative on HIV/AIDS, which was one of the few really successful bipartisan initiatives launched during the Bush administration, and to seek debt relief in the poorest and most indebted countries. These are all sort of initiatives in which I think the international relief and development organizations played a major role. And today in the United States, the coalition is attempting to elevate the priority of international development and reduction of poverty reduction on the national agenda. And in fact, virtually all of these organizations have been trying to press for the United States establishing an independent cabinet-level department of development that has a kind of broad commitment to poverty reduction and development that differed the British counterpart of what we would like to see has established, so that reducing extreme poverty will be a strategic objective in its own right and not be subservient to other more immediate security-related investment objectives. These NGOs, I think, bring 5 really important assets to their attempt to influence policy and politics. The first is, quite simply, their commitment to a compelling set of humanitarian values and a vision of a more prosperous, more equitable, and a safer world. In this sense, the missions of relief and development, their missions of relief and development are political assets because these humanitarian values have real resonance among the American people and in the world more generally. A second asset is their experience on the ground in the poorest countries. They work in literally hundreds of thousands of the world's poorest communities. This experience provides firsthand, highly textured information about the conditions and concerns of people in these communities. And with this detailed knowledge, NGOs can give voice to the aspirations and concerns of the world's poorest citizens. Or even better, they can at times help them gain a seat at the policy table to speak in their very own voice. Third, when NGOs work with independence and impartiality on both sides of civil conflicts, it can sometimes give them the credibility to contribute to peace processes. In countries like Nepal, El Salvador, and Sudan, as well as Afghanistan, Angola, and Sri Lanka, CARE delivered messages to leaders of governments and rebel authorities, international organizations, and members of the diplomatic community about the unintended harm and self-defeating practices that caused needless suffering and exacerbated hostilities. A fourth asset that these organizations bring is their presence not only at the local level in poor countries, but also at the national and international levels. Several years ago, for example, leaders from the US, UK, Norwegian, French, and German affiliates of CARE International virtually simultaneously gave testimony before committees of their Congress or Parliament in support of the reconstruction of Afghanistan. The large NGOs enjoy access to the highest levels of national and international bodies. Their leaders are invited to participate in fora with leadership of governments, corporations, and multilateral institutions. A fifth and final asset that I would identify is the size of these NGOs, measured not only by their budgets and staffs, but also by the number of individual citizens who join their advocacy campaigns or make donations each year. Within CARE USA alone, nearly 500,000 individuals give to CARE each year. And CARE's private contributions amount to well over $100 million. I have noted over and over again that this registers on leaders in government and, in fact, leaders in multilateral institutions like the World Bank, who are impressed that donations to CARE compare very favorably with the contributions that leading candidates may receive during the primary season who are running for the presidency of the United States. I don't want to exaggerate this, but it has meaning that these are organizations that have real constituencies. And in some cases, some of these international organizations would like to claim similar constituencies. There are several hundred volunteers that participated last year in the CARE Action Network from across the US, paying their way to go to Washington to learn, to be trained in advocacy techniques and to have the opportunities to lobby their members of Congress and to talk with people in the executive branch. And our counterpart organizations do the same, and sometimes we do it cooperatively under the interaction umbrella. So these five sets of assets do not guarantee that NGOs will be effective, but the assets do ensure that NGO leaders will have access to legislative and policy processes. Moreover, these particular assets gain in value as political leaders gain consciousness that the security of each nation is increasingly linked to the security of all nations and to human security everywhere. Especially since September 2001, the assets of these international NGOs have appreciated. What then are, are the limits, the limiting factors, and the political influence of the larger NGOs. Although they may have become more influential, they are hardly ruling the world. Within the US and other donor countries, there are powerful interests with a stake in policies that perpetuate world poverty. The NGOs have made few inroads against, for example, well-financed lobbyists of those interests. A prime example is the corporate agribusiness lobby that supports the federal farm bill in the United States. By successfully protecting billions of dollars in government subsidies, U.S. agribusiness blocks competition from developing countries in many commodities. NGOs have thus far been powerless to do very much to reduce these subsidies, except in a few very specific cases. There are times when no level of influence can divert a crusading national leader from his or her course. If, for example, the State Department had little influence on President Bush in the run-up to the Iraq War, neither did NGOs. CARE refused to accept U.S. government funds for contingency planning for humanitarian relief because we were concerned that it just might make even a tiny bit more probable the invasion of the U.S. And the CARE country director of Iraq, who had been there for 13 or 14 years, tried to make the case against the war at the UN, but all to no avail. With several NGO colleagues, I tried repeatedly to gain meetings with Secretary of Defense Ronald Rumsfeld. Freudian slip. Strike that from the recording of this meeting. But again, it was without success. Once or twice we actually had meetings scheduled, but he always found more pressing items on his agenda. These limitations suggest a deeper weakness in the political influence of even the largest NGOs. With the notable exception of Oxfam, they depend heavily on government funding. Thus, they can be punished or at least checkmated by donor governments that view their advocacy agenda as troublesome. Governments can turn to their own military to deliver humanitarian assistance, as the Bush administration did in Iraq and Afghanistan. And government funding agencies, such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, can turn to commercial contractors. A former administrator of USAID now rather famously advocated for commercial contractors with the rationale that they know how to take orders. The implication being that these NGOs correctly became less sort of purely implementing organizations and wanted to have a say in what it was that they were implementing. And in the face of greater political activism by NGOs, the portion of U.S. government budgets for humanitarian NGOs has been reduced over recent years. Host governments and rebel militants in developing countries can also threaten and punish NGOs that cause them trouble and they can curtail the freedom of action of these NGOs. In crisis settings like Darfur or Zimbabwe, or in Serbia in the run-up to the war in Kosovo, NGOs have had to choose between speaking out on abuses of human rights and humanitarian law and carrying out humanitarian activities directly to save lives and to relieve suffering. These can be agonizing choices for NGOs. And on occasion, governments offended by NGOs that dare speak truth to power or that otherwise provoke their ire have declared NGO country directors as persona non grata, shut down entire organizations, detained their personnel, or sought physically to intimidate them. Rebel militants have engaged in kidnapping, extortion, and murder to intimidate NGOs. Insecurity has had to become a major concern for virtually all humanitarian organizations. Despite these limitations, the direction of movement, I think, is clear. International NGOs are gaining, not losing, political influence. And they are starting to use that influence deliberately to advance an ambitious vision. They can be successful when they can bring their values, their experience, their impartiality, and their access to bear. And when their ambitions resonate with their broad constituency. They are not the strongest political influence in the world by any means, but they may be the strongest genuinely trying to end global poverty. Let me end there and open up this meeting to your questions, debate, discussion. I welcome any questions that you may have. So, yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned the four, but I'm wondering if there are other ways on the ground, especially now in places like Afghanistan, where there's, what are mechanisms in place to promote coordination and how, and how those mechanisms work successfully or
Well,
fail in some cases.
First, I think the rationale for not only coordination but collaboration with regard to policy advocacy is very clear and compelling to most NGOs. Interestingly, let me just let that stand there. There are exceptions to it. Both in the case, ironically, in some ways, two of the strongest, I think, advocacy organizations in their own right, Oxfam and MSF, sometimes are not quite as cooperative because they have such a commitment to advocacy on their own style. And building coalitions generally takes a certain amount of give and take among organizations. But I think overwhelmingly what we found out is to be effective. To be effective, most often you need to work in coalition. And indeed, the most effective coalitions of all are sometimes those that bring together strange bedfellows. That really catches the eye of policymakers and politicians. Beyond that, I think there is a long-standing readiness on the part of humanitarian NGOs, in particular the larger ones, to collaborate within emergency response. And I remember I was present in Gonaive right after the Hurricane Jean hit several years ago. And, it was just great to see it happened in that instance that CARE had a particularly strong presence in Gonaive and had a large access that was filled with vital supplies. And we opened it up to other organizations as well, and to see colleagues from Catholic Relief Services and World Vision and CARE sort of working side by side and wearing one another's, caps or T-shirts or whatever, it was heartening to see. And so I think there's a readiness to coordinate and to make transfers of material and personnel often in the emergency response itself. There's has been often much less predisposition in programming. I have, within the care context, and within the NGO Leaders Forum, been advocating for more collaboration. And it just coincidentally happens that I've urged, and this goes back several years now, Haiti as a prime opportunity for that kind of collaboration. I just think there is very much of a shared mission among these organizations. And there are fine differences among them, but by working collaboratively with one another and working collaboratively with local NGOs and to strengthen those NGOs, we could have more impact and there could be efficiencies. The problem is that those efficiencies are not, even if there were the desire to do so, will not be realized in year one. Year one and part of year two needs to be invested in building those relationships and building that trust. I think the NGO Leaders Forum is helpful at least at building a kind of communication and understanding and candor among the leaders of at least a dozen of these organizations that permits very easy exchange, and it is now routine for us to call one another on the phone. And also we haven't restricted ourselves just to the US-based organizations. We've had leaders from Africa and Asia who have joined us as well. We've had the leaders of at times environmental organizations. We're talking now about organizing a meeting with human rights counterparts. So I think there's a gradual sort of building going on at the CEO level. And I played at least a role in helping to get all of this initiated, because when I became president of CARE, I was dumbfounded to find that there was no relationship among these CEOs, that they largely saw themselves as competitors. A little bit like the relationship between the Kennedy School and the Woodrow Wilson School. That is all involved in the same cause, but you know, concerned with also the distinctiveness of our respective institution. Yes.
You mentioned the fine line between being an advocate for people and having a good relationship with government. And I wondered, I know of several people who've worked in clinics and their visas have been denied by Israel and Egypt. And I wondered if your forum has had the same experience. Where the government has decided to deny work permits to international aid workers in Egypt and Israel. Well, they work in Palestine, but Israel is out.
Well, I've heard this also to some degree. You know, there's more difficulty in a country like Ethiopia as well. I did not know that specifically about Egypt. I know from my experience in Israel that we had gone through periods where we experienced difficulty in getting or people were turned away or even detained for a period. We protested those. I don't know whether you're talking about very recent experience, because this would be a recurrence.
It was a year ago.
No, I remember this occurring, and I thought we had remedied that.
But recently, Israel denied a visa, and I don't even think it was a religious-based worker. I thought it was a
issue in Israel was that, actually, what some people who denied us perhaps the visas had forgotten was that CARE was a very early presence in Israel, at least from 1948, I believe, and it played an important role there over some decades. But 30 years later or so, we decided that we had made our contribution and that it was important to move on to other places where we're more needed, and eventually decided that one of those places was the Palestinian territory. And it was in that context, at least at a particular moment, that we had several incidents of the sort that I was describing. I believe that those have been overcome.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I say I believe that those problems have not persisted more recently in Israel.
Oh.
At least,
Something happened a couple of weeks ago.
a couple of weeks ago. Then I did not know about this, and I'm speaking primarily about the CARE experience.
Oh, well, that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, well, then you know something that I do not, and I just don't know the particulars. Christina.
I wanted to go back to something you mentioned at the end of your last comment about the NGOs viewing themselves as competitors. And I wondered, in this more coalition-friendly or collaborative environment, how you deal with that elephant in the room, that you're still competing for scarce resources. So how do you work together when sometimes there are opposing interests?
Well, it isn't clear. Well, there's opposing interests in that there are limited resources and sometimes competition for those resources. There aren't sort of simple answers to this. One thing that I said in one of the group of students with which I met today is that I think that these are often instances in which there are opportunities for individuals to show their leadership. That is, to speak for the larger cause, and to try to make these, insofar as possible, into win-win situations, but also to take satisfaction in the advancement of the larger humanitarian or poverty reduction cause. It can be challenging. I think a salutary influence that the Gates Foundation has had in emergency response is making grants for the development of trained personnel for humanitarian response to a collection of half a dozen of these organizations. All of them happen to be members of the NGO Leaders Forum. But we work together collectively in the development of those resources, and also in supporting the development of those resources within the most affected areas, too, that is with local or national NGOs. So we're not trying to gain a competitive advantage of one another, but to work together to establish high standards, being in the collective interest. I've also been engaged in explorations that have thus far fallen short of joint emergency appeals, like the joint appeal that exists, the so-called DEC, for emergency response, that brings together 13 of the major humanitarian organizations of the UK. And they have devised criteria and standards for membership. They hold sort of 25% of the resources that are donated aside for organizations that may have special resources to bring to bear in a particular emergency setting, because each one is different from the other, and they may not have worldwide the same capacity as these six. But that's proved, it was established in 1963, and it's still going, and has actually, I think, been very effective at also raising the standards of these NGOs in the UK. And among other things, raising the accountability of these organizations, because they actually, this collective appeal then does follow-up assessments of how the different respondents have performed. So it can be done. Whether it can be done in the US, where there are many more NGOs, and where, you know, it's one thing in the UK when you can, if you've really tapped in and gotten the cooperation of the BBC, you've pretty much got it made in terms of the media. But in the US, we have a much more diverse media, and yet we saw in the response to the earthquake in Haiti sort of pieces of this with the Judge Clooney Hope for Haiti and the group of NGOs that were identified by that initiative to receive response, to receive the appeal. In the donations that were made, and we've seen it in other, we see it in the former presidents coming together in a bipartisan way. And I'd like to think that this will increase rather than decrease. Not only because, as I said, these organizations, I think the broader public wants to see cooperation among these organizations, but also because I think it is in our collective interest to make it easier rather than more difficult for busy people who may not have a lot of prior experience in giving to these organizations to make their decisions as easily as possible and to be able to do it with some confidence. And that's the way it's turned out in the UK and in some other countries where this has also been tried. So it's, you know, I think chipping away. Yes, Shameen.
To piggyback on that, a handful of organizations you mentioned have religious roots, Habitat, World Vision, CRS. I'm curious if there's a different flavor that faith-based organizations bring to the table. Obviously, it's a different set of, maybe a different donor base, but in terms of on the ground, is there something that that's sort of tangible that faith-based organizations sort of bring to the discussion that we can sort of look forward to in the future, or do they operate pretty much the way any organization that sort of doesn't have religious roots?
Well, really, there's a very broad spectrum because there are some organizations like what's it called, Christian Children's Aid, was it that actually decided that it wasn't going to be a faith-based organization within the last few years. A woman at CARE who had been chief of staff working with me actually went there as president. I think the decision had been made before she went, but so now they've changed their name to reflect that. Or Mercy Corps was originally a faith-based organization, and for most purposes, I don't think considers itself as such anymore. And then you have an organization like World Vision, which has grown enormously. It's been a real juggernaut. but it remains very much a faith-based organization. But at least it's my understanding that it isn't engaged in the kind of proselytizing that it might have been engaged in the early stages of the organization. And it has thereby become much easier in some ways for an organization like CARE, which is not faith-based, to work in partnership. It's long been relatively easy for us to work with Catholic Relief Services. I think our main concern is that an organization, whether it's faith-based or not, sort of abide by basic humanitarian principles. And sometimes that faith-based can strengthen, help to underscore those principles. And then there can be times, particularly with some of the smaller faith-based organizations, that they can, depending on which faith they're representing, that they can be most intent of all at making conversions that may be in tension with delivering on the humanitarian and even the poverty reduction mission. So I'd hesitate to generalize too much. I guess I'd just say one other thing, and that is that under the Bush administration, there was a lot made of bringing in faith-based organizations. But I think when they said faith-based organizations, they weren't thinking so much of, say, Catholic Relief Services or perhaps even World Vision, not the Aga Khan Foundation. They were thinking about some of these smaller organizations that were sort of closer to the real kind of core constituency of the Bush election to the presidency. So I won't comment further. But even on those organizations, I have to say, I mean, some of those organizations later joined in a kind of alliance that CARE played a role in, of organizations that had a strong interest in broadening access to clean water. And it's interesting, as they got into the work, they learned and went through at least some conversion of their own. So you have to view these as dynamic processes and not just based on impressions gained 5 or 10 years ago. I'm sorry. Yes.
Peter, when you look at the 12 organizations, for example, in the forum, and I'm thinking, for example, of some of the work that's been done by Greg Mortensen in Afghanistan, where is education emerging as a priority within these groups?
I would say education has emerged as a stronger and stronger priority for virtually all of these organizations. And I know at CARE, when we did our first strategic plan after my arrival, and we identified sort of particular focal areas, basic and girls education was one of the 3 priority areas that we'd identified. But also, over the years, the training and education components of virtually every program in which we're engaged became increasingly important. And sort of, often it was it was education not so much in the lecturing mode and more sort of a Socratic method by which all of us were learning, including people within CARE. And of course, the advocacy in which CARE is engaged is meant to be in good measure sort of public education and education of policymakers as well, not simply narrow advocacy, but trying to help change the frame in which they look at issues. So I think it's become increasingly important. I would say in general, the proportion of people with MBAs on our boards is higher than in our staff, number one. But they exercise some influence through their roles in our board. And we have also, I know at CARE, there were certainly, there were certain parts of the organization where we looked particularly to the private sector, or in some cases even for MBAs, as being particularly contributive. I mean, one was in the area of finance and deepening financial analysis. I mean, going well beyond reporting and getting into a deeper level of interpretation and even in prognostication. I think that has been very important. And we've also borrowed directly from the private sector and people in ideas and support, not only in corporations. And I remember in the run-up to the year 2000, for example, when I developed doubts as to really how good the plans CARE had laid, and it's sort of in more than 70 countries around the world for the conversion. I heard that Bell South had completed its planning, and they were the stage of saying a job well done to themselves. And I called the CEO of Bell South, chairman of the board, and asked whether we could borrow some of the people on their team for an intensive effort at CARE. And he was very responsive. And we had a group show up, sat down with our group, and they rolled up their sleeves. And we still had, I've forgotten whether it's 2 or 3 months to go. And it was, a terrific experience. And not only did we accomplish our objectives in this case, but we learned something about one way to manage a very complex project of this sort and to rigorously monitor progress on it. So that was valuable to us. And yet another area, too, where we have learned some very positive experience, gained some very positive experience, and also learned some of the downsides of the private sector has been in human resource management and different approaches to performance appraisal. And, I was talking with a group of students earlier, too, about some of the, one of the strengths, I think, of these NGOs, which can also be a weakness, is the emphasis on consensus decision-making and the feeling that everybody needs to be a participant. On the other hand, I think it can also be said that one of the weaknesses of some corporations is the excessively hierarchical nature of those organizations. So I think we have something to learn from one another. And of course, people with MBAs are not necessarily set out to be managers. In some cases, they are. In other cases, they are really more prepared to be analysts. But there have been some that have contributed importantly to CARE. I still think that the Woodrow Wilson degree is extremely important. And if I could just say a word about this, I mentioned it in sort of the meetings with students too, and that is that I think the capacity for sort of a broader contextual analysis is really important. The kind of multidisciplinary approach is very important. Just be able to see a problem in its various facets. I think negotiating skills are important. One of the problems that we've had with a couple of CFOs that I brought from corporations, I mean, really very talented CFOs who eventually, after I think having rendered good service of care, returned to even higher positions in even larger corporations. But they found it frustrating that their word was not law within care. That they needed to convince other colleagues on the executive team and elsewhere that what they were proposing would best advance our sort of basic purposes as a humanitarian and development poverty reduction organization.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay.
Do you have the other?
You've been very patient. Oh,
Thanks for speaking with us this afternoon. I know that CARE has made some big strides in integrating gender into its work. And I'm curious if you would comment on what you think or what you have found in your experience to be the most effective ways for NGOs to integrate gender into their work without making it something of an evaluatory box checking exercise.
without making it.
Without making it something of an evaluatory box checking exercise, something that is on paper only, not in practice.
Gee, well, it's very hard for me to respond to the latter part of your question simply because it's so hard for me to imagine anybody doing that. I mean, because gender is so central to development. And you know, care is very. We think of development and poverty reduction as being first and foremost about not just increases in per capita income, but about the empowerment of people, the exercise of effective influence or control over important decisions in the lives of individuals and families and communities, and participation even in national decision making. And power relationships, among other things, relationships within the family, within the community, the ability of persons to realize their full potential are so critical. And there has been in so much of the world so much discrimination by this measure with regard, importantly, to girls and women, that, I mean, I think there's lots of research that shows that there's no better investment from a development point of view, investing in girls' education, for example. So I think, and that's not even without saying a word about human rights, which also must be an overriding and driving motivation here. So, but what I think when some of us say the sorts of things that I've just said, I think we may not, first time we think them and say them, have full appreciation of the depth of organizational commitment and the breadth of organizational commitment that it takes. I mean, it's not about an initiative. It's about making a really full-fledged commitment as to what we mean by development and what the purposes of the organization are, how we staff, how we develop our staff, and a willingness within organizations, and especially an organization like CARE that's been around for decades, the willingness of all of us within the organization to make changes in ourselves as well. So I think that's what it takes. and doing less than that isn't going to suffice, and except perhaps eventually to convince others that there's so much more that must be done. So there's something about which I feel quite strongly.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Peter. It was really great to have you.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with all of you, and excuse my sort of strained voice. You can blame Ann Corwin for that.
Yes, exactly.
But I've enjoyed my visit here. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much. That was really good. We still have another half day tomorrow.
Yes, I did.
We don't.
Yeah, well, we're working on it. We'll see. We'll just have to see how it goes. Hope for the best. I don't know if there's. We'll have to decide whether I'm going to go for it or whether I'm going to wait it out and spend another night.
I'm interested. This is my life story. Here's the questions.